The smell of turkey and disappointment filled the air at my parents' house every Thanksgiving, but this year felt different. Maybe it was because I was 32 now, and the weight of being the family failure had become too heavy to carry with any semblance of grace. Or maybe it was because my sister Jessica had just announced her promotion to senior partner at her law firm, while I sat there nursing my third beer and trying to avoid eye contact with anyone who might ask about my career. "So, Marcus, Uncle," Robert said, leaning back in his chair with that knowing smirk that had been haunting family gatherings for the past decade. "Still doing that, what was it, comic book thing?" "Graphic design," I corrected for probably the 100th time, though my voice lacked any real conviction. The truth was, I'd been unemployed for 3 months since the small marketing firm I worked for had restructured me right out of a job. Right, Robert nodded, taking a long sip of wine. "And how's that working out for you?" The table went quiet. Even my 8-year-old nephew stopped playing with his mashed potatoes to watch the latest installment of Let's Watch Marcus Squirm. It was a family tradition at this point, as reliable as my mother's dry stuffing and my father's lecture about fiscal responsibility. "It's fine," I mumbled, which was code for, "Please change the subject before I do something we'll all regret." But Jessica, flush with her recent success and apparently feeling generous with her wisdom, decided to pile on. "You know, Marcus, my firm is always looking for good people. Not attorneys, obviously, but we need paralegals, clerks, administrative support. The benefits are excellent, and it's steady work." The condescension dripped from her words like honey from a broken jar. Jessica was 2 years younger than me, but she'd somehow appointed herself as the family's unofficial life coach for my perpetual failures. She meant well, I suppose, but her help always felt more like pity wrapped in designer clothing. "I appreciate the offer," I said, forcing a smile that felt like chewing glass, "but I'm working on some projects that might..." "Projects," my father interrupted with a snort that could have registered on the Richter scale. "Marcus, you've been working on projects for 10 years. At some point, you need to accept that maybe this creative nonsense isn't going to pay the bills." And there it was, the elephant in the room, dressed up in Sunday clothes and sitting at the head of the table. My father, David Mitchell, had built a successful accounting firm from nothing, and he'd never understood why his oldest son couldn't follow a similarly practical path. To him, creativity was a luxury for people who could afford it, and I clearly couldn't. "David," my mother said quietly, in that tone that meant she was trying to keep the peace while secretly agreeing with every word he'd said. "No, Linda, someone needs to say it." My father set down his fork with the deliberate precision of a man making a point. "Marcus is 32 years old. His sister is a partner at a prestigious law firm. His cousin Jamie just bought his second house. Hell, even his nephew has a more realistic career plan, and he's 8. The nephew in question, Tyler, Jessica's son, looked up from his plate with the innocent curiosity of someone too young to understand that he'd just witnessed a verbal execution. "What's my career plan?" Tyler asked. "Astronaut," Jessica said, ruffling his hair. "Which, at this point, seems more achievable than whatever your uncle is doing." The laughter that followed felt like acid rain. I sat there watching my family bond over the shared experience of my inadequacy, and something inside me finally snapped. Not in a dramatic table-flipping way that would have given them even more ammunition for future gatherings. It was quieter than that. More like the sound a rope makes when it finally breaks under too much weight. "You know what?" I said, standing up with a calmness that surprised even me. "You're right." The laughter died immediately. This wasn't part of the script. Usually I'd defend myself weakly, make excuses, or just sit there and take it until someone changed the subject to sports or politics. "I am a failure," I continued, reaching for my jacket. "By your definitions anyway. I don't have a corner office or a company car or a 401k that could choke a horse. I make art for a living, which apparently makes me the family embarrassment." "Marcus, don't be dramatic," my mother started, but I held up a hand. "I'm not being dramatic, Mom. I'm being honest. For the first time in years, I'm being completely honest." I looked around the table at faces that ranged from uncomfortable to annoyed to smugly satisfied. "You want to know what I think?" I think you're also busy measuring success with the same tired yardstick that you can't see anything beyond your own narrow definitions. My father's face was turning the color of the cranberry sauce. That's enough, Marcus. No, it's not nearly enough. I've spent 10 years sitting at this table, listening to you people dissect my life like it's some kind of cautionary tale. Like I'm some cautionary tale. Well, here's a newsflash. I don't need your approval anymore. The silence that followed was the kind that makes you hear the house settling, the clock ticking, the sound of your own heartbeat in your ears. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the quick mental math that told them I was having some kind of breakdown that they'd be talking about for years. I've tried to explain what I do, what I'm working toward, but none of you have ever bothered to actually listen. You just wait for your turn to tell me why I'm doing it wrong. I pulled on my jacket, my hands steadier than they'd been in months. Well, I'm done explaining myself to people who've already decided I'm not worth understanding. Where are you going? Jessica asked, and for the first time she sounded more concerned than superior. Home, to work on my projects. I made air, quotes that probably looked as bitter as they felt. Don't worry, I'm sure you'll have plenty to talk about after I leave. As I walked toward the door, I heard Uncle Robert's voice behind me. Well, that went well. More laughter. Of course, I made it to my car before the shaking started. 10 years of this. 10 years of being the punchline to their success stories. The cautionary tale they told their friends about the dangers of following your dreams without a backup plan. 10 years of letting them make me feel small and foolish and naive. But as I sat in my beat-up Honda Civic in my parents' driveway, watching the warm light spill out of their dining room windows, I realized something that should have been obvious. Years ago, I didn't have to keep showing up for my own execution. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. You left your dessert. Mom's worried. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Let them worry. Let them wonder if I was finally tired enough of their bullshit to stop coming back for more. The drive home to my studio apartment took 23 minutes, which gave me plenty of time to replay every humiliating moment of the evening. But instead of the usual self-loathing spiral, I found myself getting angry. Not the hot, destructive kind of anger that makes you punch walls or send texts you regret. This was colder, more focused. The kind of anger that builds things instead of tearing them down. My apartment was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd been labeled a failure by his family. Small, cluttered with art supplies and half-finished projects, furnished mostly with hand-me-downs and things I'd found on Craigslist. But it was mine. Every sketch on the wall, every coffee stain on the desk, every book stacked in precarious towers around the room. It all represented something they couldn't understand. I sat down at my computer and opened the email I'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. It was from a startup in California, some tech company that was looking for someone to design their visual identity from the ground up, the kind of project that could either launch a career or disappear into the void of failed businesses that littered Silicon Valley like digital tumbleweeds. The money they were offering wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. More importantly, they were giving me complete creative control, something that had been increasingly rare in my freelance work. Most clients wanted someone who could execute their vision, not create one. 3 weeks ago, I'd been too scared to respond. Too conditioned by years of family criticism to believe that anyone would actually want what I had to offer. But sitting there in my cluttered apartment, still tasting the bitter aftertaste of my family's laughter, something had shifted. I started typing. Thank you for considering my portfolio. I'm very interested in discussing this project further. Took me 2 hours to craft the email, deleting and rewriting until every word felt like it belonged there. By the time I hit send, it was almost midnight, and I felt more awake than I had in months. My phone had been buzzing periodically with messages from various family members, but I didn't check them. Whatever they had to say could wait. For the first time in years, I had something more important to focus on than their opinions of my life choices. The next morning, I woke up to an email in my inbox. The startup wanted to schedule a video call for later that week. Just like that, something that had seemed impossible the day before was suddenly happening. But the real turning point came 3 days later, during my lunch break from the part-time retail job I'd taken to pay rent while looking for design work. I was sitting in my car, eating a sandwich and scrolling through social media, when I saw a post from my cousin Jamie, the one my father had held up as an example of realistic success. Grateful to announce that our company just secured its Series A funding, $2.3 million to scale our sustainable packaging solutions. Couldn't have done it without my amazing team. The post had dozens of likes and comments from family members congratulating him on his success. And there, in the comments, was my father. So proud of you, Jamie. It's wonderful to see young people with practical goals achieving real success. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a butter knife. Jamie's company made packaging from recycled materials. Creative, innovative, definitely not what anyone would have called practical when he'd started it 5 years ago in his garage. But because it was making money now, because it fit into their narrow definition of success, it was suddenly worthy of praise. That's when I realized that nothing I did would ever be good enough for them until it came with a price tag they could understand. It wasn't about the work itself, or the passion, or the potential to create something meaningful. It was about being able to point to a bank account balance and say, "See, this is why it matters." Fine. If that's what it took, then that's what I'd give them. But I'd do it on my terms, using the talents they'd spent so many years dismissing as worthless. And when I succeeded, not if, when, I'd remember every condescending comment, every pitying look, every moment they'd made me feel like I wasn't enough. The video call with the California startup went better than I could have hoped. They loved my portfolio, my ideas, my vision for their brand. By the end of the week, I had a contract that would pay me more money than I'd made in the previous 6 months combined. It was just the beginning, but it felt like vindication. I thought about calling Jessica to tell her about the job, or maybe sending my father an email to let him know that his failure son had just landed the biggest project of his career. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the growing realization that I didn't need their validation anymore. Instead, I opened a new document on my computer and started writing down goals. Not the kind of vague, wishful thinking that had guided my 20s, but specific, measurable targets with deadlines and action plans. By the time I was finished, it was 3 in the morning, and I had a roadmap that would either make me everything my family said I'd never become, or prove once and for all that they'd been right about me. Either way, I was done being their punchline. The last thing I wrote before going to bed was a note to myself. Remember this feeling. Remember why you're doing this. And when they come asking for favors, remember how they made you feel when you had nothing to offer them. I didn't know it yet, but that note would become the most important thing I'd ever written. The California startup project should have been my golden ticket out of family humiliation. But 3 months later, I was staring at an email that made my stomach drop through the floor. Due to unforeseen circumstances and a shift in our funding situation, we will be unable to move forward with the rebranding project at this time. We apologize for any inconvenience. 2 months of work, dozens of concept sketches, and 3 rounds of revisions reduced to an inconvenience. The payment I'd been counting on, the money that was supposed to prove to my family that I wasn't the failure they thought I was, had evaporated like morning mist. I read the email 17 times, hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But the message remained the same. The startup had burned through their seed funding faster than expected, and my contract was one of the first casualties of their financial reality check. My laptop sat on the rickety IKEA desk in my studio apartment, the screen casting a blue glow on the rejection letter I'd printed out like some kind of masochist. Outside, Chicago's February wind rattled my windows with the enthusiasm of someone trying to break into a house, and my radiator clanked out a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like failure, failure, failure. The timing couldn't have been worse. I'd already quit my part-time retail job, confident that the startup contract would carry me through at least the next 6 months. Now I had $347 in my checking account, rent due in 2 weeks, and a portfolio full of work that no one wanted to pay for. But the financial crisis was nothing compared to the text messages that had been piling up on my phone since Thanksgiving. My family's reaction to my dramatic exit had been predictable. From Jessica, "Mom's really upset. You need to apologize." From my mother, "I don't understand why you're being so dramatic. We're just concerned about your future." From my father, "When you're ready to have an adult conversation about your career, call me." And my personal favorite, from Uncle Robert, "Heard you had a meltdown at dinner. Maybe it's time to consider that everyone else isn't the problem." I'd ignored them all, but each message felt like another weight added to the pile of doubt that was slowly crushing my chest. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was delusional to think I could make a living with my art. Maybe the startup's cancellation was the universe's way of telling me to grow up and get a real job. The thought was so depressing that I did what any rational adult would do. I went to my neighborhood bar and proceeded to get spectacularly drunk. O'Malley's Pub was the kind of place where dreams went to die slowly, marinated in cheap whiskey and false hope. The bartender, a guy named Tony who looked like he'd seen every sob story the neighborhood had to offer, didn't even blink when I ordered my 5th beer and launched into a rambling monologue about family disappointment and artistic integrity. "Let me guess," Tony said, wiping down a glass with the practiced boredom of someone who'd heard this story 1,000 times. "You're an artist, your family thinks you're wasting your life, and you just lost a big job. How did you—" "Kid, I've been serving drinks in this neighborhood for 15 years. Your story's got more sequels than Fast and Furious." He set the beer down in front of me with a sympathetic nod. "So what are you gonna do about it?" "I don't know," I admitted, staring into the foam like it might contain answers. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should just give up and get a normal job." Tony laughed, but not unkindly. "You know how many people have sat in that exact stool and told me they were giving up on their dreams? How many? Hundreds. You know how many of them I actually believed would do it?" I shook my head. "None of them. Because people don't get this drunk over something they don't really care about. You're not mourning the death of your career, kid. You're mourning what you thought it was going to look like." Before I could ask him what that meant, my phone buzzed with another text. This one was from a number I didn't recognize. "Hey, I got your contact info from the Freelancers Forum. I'm starting a small marketing agency and I'm looking for designers. Interested in grabbing coffee to discuss?" I stared at the message for a long moment, wondering if I was drunk enough to be hallucinating, but the text remained stubbornly real, complete with a signature. Sarah Chen, founder, Breakthrough Marketing. "Good news or bad news?" Tony asked, noticing my expression. "I'm not sure yet." 3 days later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, nursing a hangover and trying to look professional for a woman who couldn't have been much older than me, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Sarah Chen was exactly the kind of person my family would approve of. MBA from Northwestern, 5 years at a major agency, and a business plan that could have been used as a textbook example of entrepreneurial thinking. She also had something I desperately needed: clients with money and a vision that extended beyond the next quarterly report. "I've seen your work," she said, sliding a printed portfolio across the table. It was mine, but seeing it organized and presented professionally made it look like it belonged to someone more successful than me. "You have a unique style, and more importantly, you understand how to tell stories through design." "Thanks," I managed, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "Here's what I'm thinking," Sarah continued, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd spent her entire career learning how to close deals. "I have the business connections and the strategic knowledge, but I need someone who can translate that into visual concepts that actually connect with people. Most designers are either too corporate or too artistic. You seem to get both sides." She was offering me a partnership. Not a job, not a contract, but an actual stake in something that could grow into something bigger than either of us could build alone. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been dreaming about, and it was being offered to me at the lowest point of my professional life. "What's the catch?" I asked. "Because there's always a catch. No salary for the first 6 months. We split everything 50-50 after expenses. But until we're profitable, you'll be working for equity and the promise of future income." She paused, studying my reaction. "I know that's not ideal, especially if you have bills to pay." I thought about my bank account, my overdue credit card payments, and the increasingly urgent voicemails from my landlord. Then I thought about my family's faces when I'd walked out of Thanksgiving dinner, and the note I'd written to myself about remembering this feeling. "I'm in," I said before I could talk myself out of it. Sarah smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. "Good, because I already told our first client that we'd have initial concepts ready by Friday." The next 6 months were a blur of 18-hour days, ramen noodles, and the kind of learning curve that either kills you or makes you stronger. Sarah hadn't been exaggerating about the no salary part, but she'd also understated her ability to find clients who were willing to pay for quality work. Our first project was rebranding a local restaurant chain that had been hemorrhaging customers to trendier competitors. The owner was skeptical of hiring such a young agency, but Sarah had convinced him to give us a chance based on my portfolio and her business plan. I spent 2 weeks eating at every location, talking to customers and employees, studying the competition and the neighborhood demographics. Then I locked myself in my apartment for another week, surviving on coffee and granola bars, while I developed concepts that captured not just what the restaurants looked like, but how they felt. The final presentation was terrifying. Sarah and I sat across from the owner and his management team, watching their faces as I explained the thinking behind each design choice. The logo that referenced the restaurant's history while feeling contemporary. The color palette that was warm enough for families but sophisticated enough for date nights. The signage system that would work in both their urban and suburban locations. When I finished, the room was quiet for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. "How much?" the owner asked finally. "For the full implementation?" Sarah didn't miss a beat. "80,000. He nodded like that was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "When can you start?" Walking out of that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. It wasn't just about the money, though the $40,000 I'd make from my share of the project would solve my immediate financial problems. It was about the validation that my work could create real value for real people. But the best part came 2 weeks later, when the restaurant's new branding launched and immediately started generating buzz on social media. Food bloggers were taking photos of the new signage. Local news picked up the story as an example of Chicago businesses embracing change. Within a month, customer traffic was up 15%. Sarah and I were sitting in our new office, a tiny space above a bookstore in Wicker Park that we'd furnished entirely with Craigslist finds and sheer determination, when she showed me the email that changed everything. "Look at this," she said, turning her laptop toward me. It was from a tech company in Austin. They'd seen the restaurant work and wanted to discuss a much larger project, a complete rebrand for their suite of productivity apps. The kind of project that would put us on the map and provide the financial stability to grow the agency into something substantial. "They want to fly us down to meet with their executive team," Sarah continued. "All expenses paid, plus a consultation fee just for the presentation." I stared at the email, reading it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining things. 6 months ago, I'd been the family failure, drinking alone in a bar and wondering if I should give up on my dreams. Now, I was being flown to Austin to pitch a Fortune 500 company. "There's something else," Sarah said, and her tone made me look up from the screen. "I've been tracking our numbers, and if we land this contract, we'll both be making more money than either of us made at our previous jobs. A lot more." That night, I sat in my apartment, the same cluttered studio that had felt like a prison 6 months earlier but now felt like a launching pad, and thought about calling my family. The urge to share my success with them was stronger than I'd expected, even after everything that had happened. But then I remembered Uncle Robert's comment about my meltdown, and my father's insistence that I needed to have an adult conversation about my career. I remembered the laughter when Jessica had compared my prospects to her 8-year-old son's astronaut dreams. They'd made it clear that my success would only matter to them if it came with the right kind of credentials, the right kind of stability, the right kind of respectability. Well, I was building all of those things, but I was doing it without their support, without their approval, and definitely without their belief in my abilities. Instead of calling them, I opened my laptop and started working on the Austin presentation. If I was going to prove them wrong, I was going to do it so thoroughly that they'd never question my choices again. But first, I had to make sure I didn't fail. The presentation in Austin went better than I'd dared to hope. The executives loved our approach, our energy, and most importantly, our results. By the time we flew back to Chicago, we had a signed contract worth more money than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. Sarah and I celebrated at the airport bar, toasting our success with overpriced wine and the kind of giddy excitement that comes from realizing your wildest hopes weren't actually that wild after all. "You know what this means, right?" Sarah said, raising her glass. "That we can afford better office furniture? That we can afford to be picky about our clients? That we can start building the kind of agency we actually want to run, instead of just taking whatever work we can find?" She was right, but there was something else it meant, something I didn't say out loud. It meant that the next time I saw my family, I wouldn't be the failure anymore. I'd be the success story they'd never seen coming. The thought should have made me happy, but instead, it made me realize how much their opinion had been driving me all along. Even in my moment of triumph, I was still measuring my worth by their standards. That had to change. Success for the sake of proving others wrong is still just another form of letting them control your life. But first, I had a business to build. 2. Years had passed since that pivotal meeting with Sarah Chen, and breakthrough marketing had evolved from a desperate partnership into something resembling an actual business. We'd moved 3 times, each office slightly larger and less furnished with Craigslist finds than the last. Our current space occupied the entire 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the West Loop, complete with exposed brick walls, industrial, lighting, and the kind of open floor plan that said, "We're serious about creativity" to prospective clients. But success, I was learning, came with its own set of challenges that no business school had prepared me for. The higher we climbed, the more visible we became, and visibility meant scrutiny from people who'd known me when I was just the family failure drinking alone in dive bars. "Marcus, your sister's online too," called Jennifer, our office manager and the first actual employee we'd been able to afford. "She says it's urgent." I stared at the blinking light on my phone like it was a bomb waiting to explode. Jessica, and I hadn't spoken since my Thanksgiving walkout 2 years ago, despite several attempts from my mother to broker some kind of peace treaty. The fact that she was calling me at work, rather than trying to guilt-trip me through family intermediaries, suggested something had shifted in the family dynamic. "Tell her I'm in a meeting," I said, then immediately felt like a coward. "Actually, no. I'll take it." Sarah looked up from her laptop, raising an eyebrow in a way that conveyed both curiosity and concern. We'd become close enough over the past 2 years that she could read my moods like a weather report, and she knew that anything involving my family usually resulted in me being distracted and irritable for days. "Jessica," I said, picking up the phone with the enthusiasm of someone answering a telemarketer. "Marcus, thank God. I wasn't sure you'd take my call." Her voice sounded different, less confident, more strained than I remembered. "Listen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you hang up." "I'm listening." "I've been following your company online. The work you're doing, the clients you're working with, it's really impressive. I mean, I always knew you were talented, but seeing it applied to actual business results..." I waited for the but that was inevitably coming. With Jessica, compliments were always the setup for a request. "The thing is," she continued, "my firm is going through some changes. The senior partners are pushing for more digital marketing capabilities, and they're looking to bring in an agency that can handle everything from brand strategy to social media management." And there it was. "You want to hire us? I want to recommend you for the RFP process. It's a significant contract, probably worth more than everything you've done this year combined. But Marcus, I need to know that you can handle something this big professionally." The implication hung in the air like smog. Despite everything I'd accomplished, despite the client testimonials and industry recognition and growing revenue, Jessica still saw me as the unstable little brother who'd had a meltdown at a family dinner. "What exactly do you mean by professionally?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "I mean, can you put aside whatever issues you have with our family and deliver the kind of work that won't embarrass me with my partners?" I looked around our office, at the team of 12 people we now employed, at the awards on the wall, at the project boards covered with strategies for Fortune 500 companies. Then I looked at Sarah, who was pretending to work while obviously listening to every word of my conversation. Jessica, in the past 2 years, we've increased revenue for our clients by an average of 37%. We've won 4 industry awards, including one from the American Marketing Association. Our client retention rate is 93%, and we've never missed a deadline or gone over budget on a project. I know, I've done my research. Then why are you asking me if I can handle this professionally? What exactly are you worried about? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Jessica finally spoke again, her tone was softer, more like the sister I remembered from before law school had turned her into a human contract. I'm worried that you still see me as the person who used to make jokes about your career at family dinners. And I'm worried that if I stick my neck out for you and something goes wrong, it'll confirm everything Dad always said about enabling your artistic phase. The honesty caught me off guard. I'd expected manipulation or condescension, not vulnerability. For what it's worth, I said carefully, I don't hold grudges against people who give me the opportunity to prove myself. I hold grudges against people who refuse to see evidence that contradicts their assumptions. So, you'll submit a proposal, send me the RFP requirements. We'll treat it like any other potential client. After I hung up, Sarah wheeled her chair over to my desk with the determined expression of someone who was about to deliver unwanted but necessary advice. That sounded complicated, she said. Everything involving my family is complicated. Are we really going to pitch her firm? I considered the question. The smart business decision was obvious. A law firm that size would be a significant client and the kind of stable, long-term contract that would allow us to take more creative risks with other projects. But accepting work from Jessica felt like validation of everything my family had always believed about my motivations. Yeah, we're going to pitch them, I said finally. But we're going to do it better than they've ever seen before. The RFP arrived. The next morning via email, a 40-page document outlining the firm's marketing challenges, budget parameters, and evaluation criteria. It was the kind of corporate doublespeak that made my eyes glaze over. But buried in the jargon was an interesting problem. The law firm was caught between two worlds. Their traditional client base valued stability and conservative presentation, but they were losing younger clients to firms that felt more modern and accessible. They needed to evolve without alienating their existing customers, a delicate balance that most agencies would try to solve with focus groups and safe committee-designed solutions. I spent the next 3 weeks living and breathing that proposal. I interviewed current clients, researched competing firms, and analyzed every piece of marketing material they'd produced in the past 5 years. I visited their offices during different times of day, observing how clients interacted with the space and the staff. I even sat in their lobby for 2 hours pretending to wait for a consultation while I watched how people responded to their current branding. Sarah had to threaten to change the locks to get me to go home at night. You know, this is just one potential client, right? She said during one of our increasingly frequent late-night strategy sessions. We have other projects, other deadlines. This isn't about the client, I admitted. This is about showing them something they didn't know was possible. Them meaning the law firm, them meaning my family. Sarah nodded like she'd suspected as much. Just remember that the best revenge is success that doesn't require an audience. She was right, of course, but I was too deep in the competitive zone to listen to wisdom. I'd spent 2 years building a reputation in the industry, but I'd done it quietly, without fanfare or family bragging rights. This was my chance to create something so undeniably impressive that even my father would have to acknowledge it. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the law firm's main conference room, the same space where Jessica had probably conducted thousands of depositions and negotiations. Walking into that environment, wearing my best suit and carrying our proposal bound in custom presentation folders, I felt like I was entering enemy territory. But I also felt ready. The partners who attended the presentation were exactly what I'd expected: successful, skeptical, and accustomed to being the smartest people in the room. They listened politely as I explained our research findings and strategic recommendations, but I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. They were measuring me against their preconceptions of what a marketing agency should look like. That's when I pulled out the secret weapon I'd been working on for weeks. Before we discuss implementation, I said, I'd like to show you something that isn't part of our formal proposal. I connected my laptop to their presentation system and opened a video I'd created using motion graphics and client testimonials. But it wasn't about our agency. It was about their firm, told from the perspective of their clients. The video opened with a young entrepreneur describing how the firm had helped her navigate a complex intellectual property dispute. It showed an older client explaining how their estate planning services had protected his family's legacy. It featured employees talking about the firm's commitment to pro bono work and community involvement. But the genius was in how I'd presented it. Instead of the sterile corporate video that most law firms produced, this felt warm and human while still maintaining the gravitas that their clients expected. The visuals were sophisticated but not flashy. The music was subtle but emotional, and the message was clear. This was a firm that cared about people, not just profits. When the video ended, the room was quiet for a moment that felt like an eternity. "How did you get our clients to participate in this?" asked one of the senior partners. "I didn't," I said. "These are testimonials from your website and social media, reorganized and presented in a way that tells a coherent story about who we are and what you value." Another partner leaned forward. "You're saying you created this entire video using content we already had?" "Exactly. Most firms have the raw materials for powerful marketing. They just don't know how to assemble them into something compelling." I could see Jessica in my peripheral vision, sitting straighter in her chair as she realized that her little brother had just delivered a presentation that was about to make her look very good to her colleagues. The questions that followed were detailed and technical, but underneath the professional discourse, I could sense something shifting. They weren't just evaluating a vendor anymore. They were recognizing a peer. When we finished, the lead partner walked me to the elevator personally. Something I'd learned was a good sign in corporate environments. "Marcus," he said, "I have to admit, when Jessica first suggested your agency, I was skeptical. But what you've shown us today is exactly the kind of thinking we need. I appreciate that. There's just one more thing." He paused, studying my face. "Jessica mentioned that you two are related. I hope that won't create any complications if we move forward." It was a fair question, and I appreciated his directness. "My relationship with my sister will always be personal. My work is professional. I've never confused the two." He nodded, like that was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. "We'll have a decision for you by Friday." The call came Thursday afternoon. Not only had we won the contract, but they'd increased the budget to include additional services they hadn't originally planned to outsource. It was the largest deal in our company's history, and it would establish us as a serious player in the Chicago market. But the real validation came in a text from Jessica that evening. "Dad asked me to get him your business card. I think he wants to understand what you're building." For 2 years, I'd been grinding in the shadows, building something real while my family remained blissfully unaware of my progress. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought, that their opinion was irrelevant to my success. But seeing that text, knowing that my father was finally curious enough to look beyond his preconceptions, felt like a victory I hadn't realized. I was still fighting for. The danger, I was beginning to understand, wasn't that my family would never recognize my success. The danger was that I was still seeking their recognition in the first place. That night, I sat in my newly renovated apartment, the one with actual furniture and art on the walls and a kitchen that wasn't dominated by ramen noodles, and tried to process everything that had happened. 2 years ago, I'd been unemployed and humiliated, convinced that my family was right about my prospects. Now I was running a successful agency, working with prestigious clients, and finally earning the respect I'd always craved. But something felt incomplete. Maybe it was because the victory had come through Jessica's intervention rather than my own merit. Maybe it was because I was still measuring my worth by their standards instead of my own. Or maybe it was because success achieved for the purpose of proving others wrong is never quite as satisfying as success achieved for its own sake. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from my mother. Jessica told us about your presentation. We're proud of you. I stared at those 5 words for a long time. We're proud of you. The phrase I'd been waiting to hear for over a decade, finally delivered through a text message after I'd proven myself in terms they could understand. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like something ending. Not my relationship with my family, but my need for their approval. I'd built something meaningful without their support, and I could continue building it whether they were proud of me or not. That realization was more liberating than any amount of professional success. But I wasn't done proving myself yet. Not by a long shot. 5 years. That's how long it took for everything to change overnight. I was sitting in my office at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in March, nursing my second cup of coffee and reviewing quarterly reports, when Sarah burst through my door with her laptop clutched to her chest and an expression that oscillated between pure terror and unbridled excitement. "Marcus, you need to see this right now," she said, practically vibrating with energy as she set her laptop on my desk and turned it toward me. The screen showed an email from someone named David Morrison at Morrison Creative Holdings, a name that meant nothing to me until I read the signature line. David Morrison wasn't just any business executive. He was the former chief marketing officer of Apple, the guy who'd helped launch 3 of their most successful product lines before leaving to start his own creative investment firm. And apparently, he wanted to meet with us. Breakthrough marketing has been brought to our attention through multiple industry sources. The email read, "And we believe your approach to integrated brand storytelling aligns with several opportunities in our current portfolio. Would you be available for a conversation this week regarding a potential partnership that could scale your operations significantly?" I read the email 3 times, each pass making it feel less real rather than more. Companies like Morrison Creative Holdings didn't just reach out to small agencies in Chicago. They worked with global firms, international conglomerates, the kind of clients that had entire floors dedicated to marketing departments. "How did they even know we exist?" I asked, still staring at the screen. "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Sarah said, pulling up another window on her laptop. "I've been digging through our referral analytics, and it looks like someone from Jessica's law firm mentioned us to a client who mentioned us to their marketing director, who apparently plays golf with someone at Morrison's portfolio company. The butterfly effect in action. A single presentation to my sister's law firm had created a chain reaction that somehow reached one of the most influential people in the creative industry." "There's more," Sarah continued, opening another email. This came in 20 minutes after the Morrison message. The second email was from Netflix. They were looking for an agency to handle the launch campaign for a new documentary series, and somehow our name had made it onto their shortlist. The timeline was aggressive. They needed initial concepts within 2 weeks, but the exposure alone would be worth more than any fee they could pay. "Sarah," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears, "I think we're about to get very busy." The meeting with David Morrison was scheduled for the following Monday at his office in downtown Chicago. I spent the weekend in a state of controlled panic, preparing for a conversation that could either launch us into a completely different league or expose us as imposters who'd somehow fooled their way into the big leagues. Morrison Creative Holdings occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower that probably cost more to lease than our entire annual revenue. The reception area looked like it belonged in a modern art museum, all clean lines and carefully curated installations that somehow managed to be both intimidating and inspiring. David Morrison himself was not what I'd expected. Instead of the polished corporate executive I'd imagined, he looked more like a college professor who'd wandered into the wrong building. Rumpled khakis, vintage sneakers, and a t-shirt that had definitely seen better days. But his eyes had the kind of focus that made you understand how he'd convinced millions of people to buy products they didn't know they needed. "Marcus, Sarah," he said, shaking our hands with the firm grip of someone who'd learned to make quick judgments about people. "Thanks for coming down. I have to admit, I was curious to meet the team behind some of the work I've been hearing about." He led us to a conference room that offered a spectacular view of Lake Michigan, but my attention was focused on the wall display behind the conference table. It was covered with campaign materials from some of the most successful product launches of the past decade, not just Morrison's Apple work, but projects from dozens of agencies and brands that had somehow influenced or collaborated with his firm. "Here's what I'm thinking," Morrison said, settling into his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd had this conversation countless times. "I invest in companies that have the potential to become category leaders, but most of them struggle with one fundamental challenge. They don't know how to tell their story in a way that actually matters to people." He clicked a remote, and the wall display changed to show a grid of logos, startups and established companies across industries from biotech to consumer electronics. These are all portfolio companies that need what you do, but at a scale that would require you to fundamentally change how you operate. I'm not talking about taking on a few additional clients. I'm talking about building the infrastructure to handle simultaneous campaigns for dozens of brands across multiple markets. Sarah and I exchanged a glance. This was the kind of opportunity that entrepreneurs dream about and have nightmares about in equal measure. The chance to scale beyond anything we'd imagined, but also the risk of growing so fast that we lost control of the quality that had gotten us here in the first place. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "A partnership," Morrison said. "I provide the capital, the connections, and the business development infrastructure. You provide the creative leadership and the strategic thinking that's made your work stand out. We build something that neither of us could create independently." The terms he outlined were generous but complex. Morrison Creative Holdings would essentially become our majority partner, providing not just funding, but access to their network of portfolio companies and industry contacts. In exchange, we'd commit to a 5-year growth plan that would take us from a 12-person agency to a regional powerhouse with the capacity to compete for national accounts. "I need to be honest with you," Morrison continued, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering crucial information. "This kind of growth isn't for everyone. The pressure is constant, the expectations are brutal, and there's no guarantee that what works at your current scale will work when you're 10 times larger." "But if it does work?" Sarah asked. Morrison smiled. "If it works, you'll be running one of the most influential creative agencies in the Midwest, working with clients that most firms can only dream about, and building the kind of legacy that outlasts individual campaigns." The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering everything from operational logistics to creative philosophy to the specific metrics Morrison used to evaluate portfolio company performance. By the time we left, my head was spinning with possibilities and concerns in roughly equal measure. "So," Sarah said as we waited for the elevator, "what do you think?" "I think we're about to find out whether we're actually as good as we think we are." The Netflix project became our testing ground for everything Morrison had proposed. The documentary series was about innovative entrepreneurs who disrupted traditional industries, and the marketing challenge was to create a campaign that would appeal to both business audiences and general viewers interested in compelling human stories. I assembled a team that included our best designers, strategists, and account managers, plus 3 freelancers we'd worked with on previous projects. For 2 weeks, we essentially lived at the office, developing concepts that ranged from traditional advertising to experiential marketing to social media campaigns that would launch before the series premiere. The breakthrough came during a late-night brainstorming session, when one of our junior designers suggested something that was either brilliant or completely insane. Instead of creating advertisements for the series, what if we created the same kind of disruptive marketing campaign that the entrepreneurs featured in the documentary might have used? The idea evolved into a multi-platform campaign that included guerrilla marketing installations in major cities, social media content that looked like it came from the featured entrepreneurs themselves, and partnerships with actual startups that shared similar stories. Instead of selling the series directly, we were selling the mindset and the inspiration that the series represented. Netflix loved it. More importantly, they trusted us to execute it without the kind of micromanagement that usually accompanied projects of this scale. The campaign launched 6 weeks later, and within 48 hours, it was generating the kind of social media buzz that marketing executives dream about. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. A call from my father. "Marcus." His voice on the phone sounded different, less authoritative, more curious. I've been seeing your company's name in some of the marketing publications I follow for work. This Netflix campaign, that's your agency? Yes, I said, not sure where this conversation was heading. I have to admit, I don't understand everything about what you do, but the business results are impressive. Jessica showed me some of the coverage you've been getting, and I wanted to congratulate you. It was the first time my father had acknowledged my work without qualification or condition. Not congratulations, but you should still think about a backup plan. Or, that's nice, but is it sustainable? Just acknowledgement that I'd built something worth recognizing. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. There's actually something else I wanted to discuss with you, he continued, and I could hear him shifting into his business voice. My firm has been struggling with some marketing challenges lately. We're good at what we do, but we're not great at explaining why people should choose us over our competitors. I was wondering if you might have time to take a look at our materials and give us some advice. The irony was so thick I could taste it. 5 years after walking out of a family dinner where my father had dismissed my career as creative nonsense, he was asking for my professional help. Not as a favor to family, but as a legitimate business consultation. I'd be happy to take a look, I said. But I should mention that our consulting rates have increased significantly since the last time we talked. He laughed, actually laughed at that. I would hope so. Success should be profitable. The consultation with my father's accounting firm led to a 6-month project that redesigned their entire client communication strategy. Working with my father in a professional capacity was strange at first, but it also gave me a new perspective on his character. Stripped of family dynamics and generational expectations, he was actually a pretty smart businessman who'd built something substantial from nothing. More importantly, he was finally seeing me as a peer rather than a problem to be solved. The momentum from the Netflix campaign and the Morrison partnership created a cascade of opportunities that stretched our capacity to its limits. Within 6 months, we'd added 18 new employees, moved to a larger office space, and started turning down projects that would have been dream assignments just a year earlier. But the real breakthrough wasn't professional, it was personal. I was having dinner with Jessica and her family, something that had become a monthly tradition since we'd started working together professionally, when 8-year-old Tyler asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Uncle Marcus, are you rich? Now?" Jessica started to scold him for being rude, but I held up a hand. It was actually a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding thinking about seriously. "What do you mean by rich?" I asked him. Tyler considered this with the serious expression of a child who'd clearly been thinking about this topic for a while. Like, do you have enough money to buy whatever you want? And do people think you're important? "Well," I said, looking around the restaurant where we were sitting, a place I could now afford without checking my bank balance first. "I have enough money to take care of myself and the people I care about, and some people think the work I do is important, which is maybe more valuable than them thinking I'm important. So you're not a failure anymore?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel. Tyler had no idea about the family history he was referencing, but because it forced me to confront how much of my identity had been built around proving that label wrong. "I don't think I was ever actually a failure," I said, as much to myself as to him. "I think I was just taking a different path than other people expected." Later that night, driving home through the city where I'd built my business and my life, I thought about that 8-year-old's question. Was I rich? By any reasonable measure, yes. My company was valued at more than I'd ever dreamed possible. My personal income had reached the point where financial stress was a memory rather than a daily reality, and I had the kind of professional reputation that opened doors I hadn't even known existed. But more than that, I was doing work that mattered to me, with people I respected, for clients who valued what we brought to their challenges. I'd built something that would exist whether my family understood it or not, whether they approved of it or not, whether they were proud of it or not. That realization was worth more than any amount of money or recognition. I'd spent so many years fighting to prove my worth that I'd almost missed the point when I actually became worthy. Not because I'd finally earned their approval, but because I'd learned to value my own. The next morning, I walked into the office to find Sarah waiting for me with another laptop. another expression of barely contained excitement. "Please tell me it's good news this time," I said. "Morrison just called," she said, practically bouncing in her chair. "One of his portfolio companies is going public next year, and they want us to handle the entire brand identity for the IPO launch. It's the biggest project we've ever been offered." I looked around our office, at the team we'd built, the work on the walls, the constant hum of people creating something meaningful, and realized that I'd stopped thinking about proving my family wrong and started focusing on proving myself right. "Let's do it," I said, "and let's make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Because I had a feeling that this was just the beginning. The text message arrived at 11:43 p.m. on a Sunday, which should have been my first warning that something was seriously wrong. Uncle Robert, the same Uncle Robert who'd spent years making jokes about my comic book thing at family gatherings, was asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss a business opportunity. I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to process the cognitive dissonance of the family's most vocal critics suddenly wanting to talk business with me. 3 years had passed since David Morrison's partnership had transformed our agency into a regional powerhouse, and in that time, I'd grown accustomed to respect from unexpected quarters. But this felt different. This felt desperate. The coffee meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at a neutral location downtown. Arrived early, partly out of habit and partly because I wanted to observe Robert's demeanor before we started talking. When he walked into the cafe 15 minutes later, I barely recognized him. The confident, condescending man who'd spent years lecturing me about realistic career goals had been replaced by someone who looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few months. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and he carried himself with the deflated posture of someone who'd recently received very bad news. "Marcus," he said, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Thanks for meeting with me. I know this might seem unusual." "That's one word for it," I replied, gesturing toward the table I'd chosen in the back corner, private enough for a confidential conversation, but public enough to ensure this didn't turn into an ambush. Robert ordered black coffee and spent several minutes adding sugar with the focused concentration of someone buying time to organize his thoughts. When he finally looked up, I could see something in his eyes that I'd never associated with him before: humility. "I'm going to cut straight to the point," he said. "My company is in trouble, serious trouble, and I need help from someone who understands modern marketing in a way that I clearly don't." Robert owned a mid-sized construction company that had been profitable for over 20 years, specializing in commercial projects and municipal contracts. But the industry had changed dramatically in recent years, with younger competitors leveraging digital marketing and social media to win contracts that his company had always considered locks. "I've lost 4 major bids in the past 6 months, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Projects that should have been ours based on experience and track record. But these new firms are presenting themselves in ways that make us look outdated and out of touch." I listened without interrupting as he detailed the scope of his problems. His company's website looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. Their marketing materials consisted of photocopied flyers and business cards that screamed small-time operation. Their social media presence was non-existent, and their brand identity was essentially a logo that Robert had designed himself using clip art. "The worst part," he said, running his hands through his thinning hair, "is that I know we do better work than these competitors. Our safety record is spotless, our projects always come in on time and under budget, and we have relationships with suppliers and subcontractors that go back decades. But none of that matters if we can't communicate it effectively." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. For years, Robert had dismissed my work as frivolous and impractical, arguing that real businesses succeeded through hard work and competence rather than fancy marketing tricks. Now he was discovering that competence without effective communication was increasingly worthless in a connected economy. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. "I want to hire your agency to completely rebrand my company. Website, marketing materials, social media strategy, the whole package. I know it won't be cheap, and I know I don't deserve any family discounts after the way I've treated you over The years. There it was. The man who'd spent a decade making me feel like a failure was now asking me to save his business. The psychological tables had completely turned, but I found myself feeling more thoughtful than triumphant. Robert, before we talk about business, I think we need to address the personal history here. You've spent years telling anyone who would listen that I was wasting my life on creative nonsense. Now you're asking me to use that same creative nonsense to save your company. He nodded, accepting the criticism without defensiveness. You're absolutely right. I was wrong about you, wrong about your work, and wrong about the direction the business world was heading. I let my own prejudices and generational assumptions blind me to what you were actually building. The admission was more than I'd expected, but I pressed further. Do you actually understand what we do now, or are you just desperate enough to try anything? Honestly, a little of both. Robert's laugh was rueful and self-aware. I've spent the past month studying your company's case studies and client testimonials. I still don't understand all the technical aspects, but I can see the results. You help businesses tell their stories in ways that connect with customers and drive revenue. That's exactly what I need. Over the next hour, Robert laid out the full scope of his company's challenges. The construction industry in Chicago was more competitive than ever, with new firms entering the market every month. Municipal contracts that his company had won automatically for years were now going to competitors who presented more professional proposals and maintained stronger relationships with decision makers. The city's procurement department is full of people in their 30s and 40s now, Robert explained. They expect vendors to have professional websites, social media presence, and the ability to communicate digitally. I've been trying to win contracts the same way I did 20 years ago, and it's not working anymore. As he talked, I found myself genuinely interested in the business challenge, separate from any personal satisfaction about the role reversal. Construction companies were notoriously bad at marketing themselves, which created opportunities for agencies that could bridge the gap between traditional industries and modern communication strategies. Here's what I'm thinking, I said, pulling out my phone to take notes. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Complete rebrand, new website, professional photography of your projects, case studies that demonstrate your expertise, and a social media strategy that positions you as the established, reliable choice rather than trying to compete with startups on their terms. Robert's eyes lit up for the first time since he'd arrived. That sounds perfect. What would something like that cost? I quoted him our standard rate for comprehensive rebranding projects, watching his face carefully for his reaction. It was more money than he'd probably spent on marketing in the past 5 years combined, but he didn't flinch. When could you start? He asked. I'll need to discuss it with my team and see how it fits with our current project schedule. But Robert, before we move forward, I need you to understand something. If we take this project, you're not hiring your nephew who used to do comic book stuff. You're hiring a professional agency that commands premium rates and delivers measurable results. The family relationship doesn't give you special treatment or unlimited revisions. I understand completely, he said. I want you to treat this like any other client engagement. 3 weeks later, our team was deep into the research phase of Robert's rebrand, and I was discovering layers of irony I hadn't anticipated. His construction company was actually a fascinating business with a 40-year history of innovative projects and community involvement. They'd built schools, libraries, and affordable housing developments that had genuinely improved people's lives. Robert just had no idea how to talk about any of it in compelling terms. The project became a case study in how traditional businesses could evolve their communication strategies without abandoning their core values. Instead of trying to make Robert's company look like a tech startup, we positioned them as the experienced, reliable choice in an industry full of fly-by-night competitors. The website we designed featured detailed case studies of their major projects, testimonials from satisfied clients, and behind-the-scenes content that showcased their craftsmanship and attention to detail. The photography we commissioned made their job sites look like architectural marvels rather than construction zones. But the real breakthrough came when we convinced Robert to start writing monthly blog posts about industry trends and project management challenges. His writing was conversational and knowledgeable in a way that established genuine authority without corporate jargon. Within 6 months, his blog had become a go-to resource for other contractors and municipal procurement officers. The results were immediate and dramatic. Robert's company won their next 3 major bids, including a municipal contract worth more than their previous best year. Their website traffic increased by 400%, and they started receiving inquiries from potential clients who had found them through search engines rather than traditional networking. More importantly, Robert seemed to genuinely understand what we'd accomplished and how it connected to his business success. He wasn't just grateful for the results. He was curious about the strategy behind them. "I have to admit," he said during one of our monthly review meetings, "I thought marketing was just about making things look pretty and writing catchy slogans. I didn't realize how much psychology and business strategy was involved." "Most people don't," I replied. "That's why they either dismiss it as fluff or expect it to work like magic. The reality is somewhere in between." The success of Robert's rebrand created a ripple effect that I hadn't anticipated. Word spread through their industry network, and suddenly we were getting inquiries from other construction companies, manufacturing firms, and traditional businesses that had realized they needed to modernize their marketing approach. But the most significant call came from an unexpected source: my father. "Marcus," he said when I answered the phone, "I've been watching what you did for Robert's company, and I'm wondering if you might have time to discuss a similar project for my firm." This was different from the consultation work we'd done years earlier. My father wasn't asking for advice. He was asking to hire us for a complete modernization of his accounting practices, brand, and marketing strategy. "Dad, are you sure about this? Working with family can get complicated." "I'm sure," he said. "And frankly, after seeing how professionally you handled Robert's project despite your history with him, I'm confident you can separate business from personal relationships." The project with my father's firm turned out to be even more complex than Robert's construction company. Accounting practices face unique challenges in marketing themselves. They need to project competence and trustworthiness while differentiating themselves in a crowded market. Many potential clients see all accountants as essentially interchangeable, so creating meaningful differentiation requires sophisticated positioning strategy. Working with my father in a professional capacity gave me insights into his character that I'd never had access to before. Stripped of family dynamics and generational expectations, he was actually a thoughtful business owner who genuinely cared about his clients and employees. He'd built his practice on relationships and referrals, but he'd never learned how to scale those strengths through modern marketing channels. The transformation we created for his firm was subtle but powerful. Instead of generic messaging about quality service and competitive rates, we positioned them as the accounting practice that helped small business owners sleep better at night. The website featured video testimonials from clients explaining how my father's firm had helped them navigate complex financial challenges, and the blog focused on practical advice for business owners rather than technical accounting minutiae. 6 months after the rebrand launched, my father's firm had attracted more new clients than in the previous 3 years combined. But more than that, the quality of their new clients had improved dramatically. They were working with business owners who valued strategic financial advice rather than just looking for the cheapest option. "I owe you an apology," my father said during our final project review meeting. "Not just for the way I treated your career choices over the years, but for fundamentally misunderstanding what you do and why it matters." "Dad, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "I spent years telling you to get a real job because I thought marketing was just advertising and sales gimmicks. I didn't understand that what you do is actually business strategy disguised as creativity. You help companies understand who they are and communicate that identity effectively. That's not fluff, that's essential." The conversation marked a fundamental shift in our relationship. For the first time in my adult life, my father saw me as a peer and a professional rather than a son who needed guidance. It was the validation I'd spent decades seeking, but it arrived at a moment when I no longer needed it to feel complete. The strangest part of the whole experience was how little satisfaction I felt from the role reversal. Years earlier, I'd fantasized about the moment when my family would come asking for my help, imagining how vindicated I'd feel when they finally recognized my worth. But the reality was more complex and less triumphant than I'd expected. Success hadn't just changed my professional circumstances. It had changed my perspective on the relationships that had once defined my self-worth. I no longer needed my family's approval to feel successful, which meant that their recognition, when it finally came, felt more like a bonus than a necessity. The real satisfaction came from the work itself and the impact it had on our clients' businesses. Helping Robert save his construction company and watching my father's practice thrive felt meaningful in ways that had nothing to do with family dynamics or personal vindication. One evening, as I was reviewing proposals for 3 new projects that had come in that week, Sarah knocked on my office door with a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "What's the occasion?" I asked. "I just got off the phone with Morrison," she said, pouring the champagne with a grin. "The IPO we handled last year? The company's stock price has tripled since launch, and they're crediting our brand positioning as one of the key factors in investor confidence." We clinked glasses, celebrating not just the financial success, but the knowledge that our work had contributed to something genuinely meaningful. The company whose IPO we'd managed was developing medical devices that would improve treatments for cancer patients. Our brand strategy had helped them communicate their mission effectively enough to secure the funding they needed to save lives. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah continued. "We're booked solid for the next 18 months. We're turning down more projects than we accept, and we're doing work that actually matters. Remember when you used to worry that your family was right about your career being a waste of time?" I laughed, thinking about how foreign those concerns seemed now. "I remember being afraid that I'd never prove them wrong. I never imagined I'd reach a point where it didn't matter whether they were wrong or right." "That's the thing about real success," Sarah said. "It's not about proving other people wrong. It's about building something so meaningful that other people's opinions become irrelevant." She was right, of course. The family members who had once dismissed my career were now calling me for help with their businesses. The uncle who'd made jokes about my comic book thing was recommending our agency to his industry contacts. The father who'd lectured me about realistic career goals was proudly telling his clients about his son's marketing expertise. But none of that mattered as much as the knowledge that I'd built something valuable, something that made a difference in the world, something that would exist and thrive regardless of anyone else's opinion about its worth. The next morning, I walked into our office, now occupying an entire floor of a renovated warehouse in the heart of Chicago's creative district, and surveyed the team of 43 people who had helped build something none of us could have created alone. The walls were covered with awards, client testimonials, and photos from campaign launches that had exceeded everyone's expectations. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, Jessica's son, now 13 and apparently considering his career options. "Uncle Marcus, do you think I could work at your company when I'm older? It looks like you have a lot more fun than the lawyers." I smiled, typing back, "If you're willing to work hard and learn constantly, there will always be a place for you here." But then I added, "Just make sure you're doing it because you love the work, not because you want to prove anything to anyone else," because that, I'd learned, was the difference between success and satisfaction. Success could be measured in revenue and recognition and the respect of people who had once doubted you. But satisfaction came from knowing that you'd built something meaningful, something that improved the world in some small way, something that would matter whether anyone was watching or not. And in the end, that was worth more than any amount of family approval.